So, as it is our custom, I will start from going over a few of the points we discussed previously, and then hopefully we'll move to explore slightly new territory. So, one way to think about what we've been doing so far is that we've been tracing a certain move, a bit like a chord progression. And we were learning to perform this chord progression in a number of different scales, in a number of different environments, moving between politics, technology, aesthetics, representation, and each one of them, we were trying to kind of turn the whole conversation around and in order to look at it sideways. So, for instance, in the first session, we took this very familiar notion of the relationship of the image as being defined in its relationship to a model of which it is a copy. And we tried to turn it around and say, what will happen if we think of an image not as something that copies reality, but as something that is placed in a frame? What kind of relationship to the image we can have if we free ourselves from this binary position, image thing, model copy, and establish another relationship which is non-binary, which uses different underpinnings. The question is not so much what is true or what is false. The question is what is possible to do with each one of these approaches. And later on, when we moved on to the notion of the subject and representation, again, we're trying to move it slightly in order to look at the two as codependent constants. So the notion of subjectivity on all its political baggage, on all its investment in identity politics, and all its kind of rich and beautiful history in art and literature, and and the whole Western culture, including the German Romantics, appears to us in a slightly different light, because we realize that this notion of the subject or subjectivity is the one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin is representation, what in German is called Vorstellung. And it's very interesting how this notion of representation appears in German philosophy exactly at the same time when representation, the romantic notion, the romantic idea of the sublime takes hold. So we kind of played exactly the same move in different domains. We also did something similar, even though admittedly we had to went over it quite briefly, when we look at technology. And there we were trying to see if it is possible to establish a relationship to technology which is not utilitarian, which is not looking at technology as a tool, but something much more fundamental to the notion of life itself. We used Heidegger to think about technology as life rather than as means or a tool. And I know that it left a few of you sort of feeling that you didn't quite get the right answers in the right way into it. It could be that today we'll have a little bit of time to deal with this question in more depth, and if not, then I will do it in the next session. Okay, and last week we were trying to do the same move, switching from thinking about an image as an image and thinking about it as an event. Yeah, what is happening when we allow ourselves to look at an image, and it doesn't really matter whether we talk about a photograph or a building or a genetic sequence. There are many kinds of images. But what if we look at it not as a representation, not in pictorial terms, but as an event? So, again, a little move. Today, the kind of move that I want to do with you continues the continues the investigation we started last week into the event, but we're going to take it into two dimensions today, I hope. On one hand, we're going to look at the notion of the event in the context of politics. And on the other, we're going to look at the notion of the event in the context of multiplicity, what also gets, you probably might be familiar with this as the rhizome or multiplicity or becoming. I will try to explore some of these terms with you. And I would be very pleased if by the end of this session you will get a sense that you know what, for instance, what multiplicity means when we come to think about the visual on the one hand and the political on the other. So, this is how I thought we can summarize the, not to summarize, but let's say to enter the essay that Foucault is contributed to as an introduction to this book, Anti-Oedipus. It is really very interesting book. It's not often that a book of philosophy becomes a national bestseller. And that's exactly what happened to this book when it was first published. I think it was 1972. So let's just spend a couple of minutes positioning this text in a sort of context of perhaps historical, cultural context. Everything we dealt with so far really belongs to events before 1968. So that's where the work of Heidegger is placed. Then the 1968 student revolts were were kind of a watershed in the intellectual life, at least in France and Germany, probably in Italy and in some other places as well. Now, this is not really the place to discuss these revolts in detail, but suffice it to say, because we will come back to that in a bit more detail later, suffice it to say that when the event of these revolts, and that really was an event of sorts, produced a group of intellectuals that that started to develop a new methodological approach to old ingrained problems and questions around methodologies, politics, knowledge, narratives. So you could say, for instance, that the so-called postmodern period is starting roughly from that moment of 1968. Now, what happened is that at the time, there were the student revolts in Paris. They were linked to revolts in factories. It was not very long-lasting revolution, but it marked. What was interesting about it is that it marked deep dissatisfaction with the liberal capitalist state. And that is something that we need to ponder about, because according to many indicators from the past, this liberal capitalist state was kind of the best thing money can buy. That was the best thing on offer. Yeah, it was not the Nazi Germany, because the liberal state, managed to defeat it in the Second World War. It was not Soviet Russia. It was not Mao's China. It was not the Khmer Rouge. It was kind of, the life was good. Yeah, that is the point. And yet, the revolts. So this is quite interesting. And for many people, that indicated that old ways of thinking politically are somehow not working. So no one summarized this situation better than Foucault in the first pages of this introduction. The introduction itself is very short, and you could almost commit it to memory. I'll get the file online. Yeah, can I just pause here for a second? Just tell you that for next week, because I will forget it, I will not do it now. Next week on the website, it says that you need to read on the refrain from Thousand Plateaus. But I changed my mind and I asked you to read instead difference in the chapter Image of Thought from Difference in Repetition. The jury is out what is harder. I somehow thought that this would be more fun. You might disagree. But you're welcome to read both if you want. But this chapter, Image of Thought, I think it's so relevant to our attempt to understand what is an image. Because, well, we'll get to that next week. So just to draw your attention to this anomaly, that the website says one thing and there is another thing in the folder, and we're going to go with what is on the folder. Okay? All right. So let me just find. Now, the conversation today will take us in a couple of directions. So I just want to tell you straight away what to expect. So we need to, in order to make sense of this introduction, and also to see what is its purchase on the question of the image, we need to somehow explore what is the fundamental logic of political thinking. Because that will allow us to see to what extent this form of thinking is also invested in the photographic image that we are dealing with today. Now, if you remember when we spoke in the first session about the frame, we said that the frame creates a certain environment where data becoming information. Yeah? Now, I just wanted to point out quickly, I don't have a pen here today, that anyone has a marker pen, a magic marker? No? No one here teaches in their free time? Okay, so I'm going to do it. Well, this notion of the frame that takes input from one end, yeah, then something happens here, and then there is output from another. We call it our frame, and that's what happens when we frame, let's say, something in the viewfinder. However, that's exactly what happens also when you think about how algorithms operate. What is an algorithm? An algorithm is an instruction. The instruction might be take any input, let's say divide it by 2 and output the result. Yeah? It doesn't matter what comes in. This is the operation of the black box and something comes out. So let's say the letter A comes in, then it will be A is divided by 2 and the result is coming out. Yeah? So the frame, the photographic frame operates exactly like an algorithm. I would say the frame is an algorithm. Yeah? Why is it important? Why is it interesting? Because one of the things we're going to explore later on in this course is to what extent algorithms constitute pervasive but also invisible and maybe even somehow secret presence in everyday life. Now, there are many manifestations today about the way algorithms control our lives. You know, there is, for instance, such thing as predictive policing. I don't know if you heard about it, but it is possible police can know in advance where a crime will be committed. Yeah, so they can just, it's a little bit like Minority Report, if you remember this film. Yeah, so that's one example of the way algorithms are not really chained to your computer or your phone or your laptop, but they really, to some extent, contort, conform the materiality of everyday life. Yeah, the search engine algorithm is also quite interesting in that sense. The search engine algorithm is more complex than that because it also has this element that you search for something, the algorithm does its operation, you get an output. So basically here, if you are here as a user, yeah, you send the search here into the black box, forget that for now. So there is an output, but the output, whatever it is, yeah, is interacting with the user and all the time collecting information about the user, and it is this kind of back and forth. And this back and forth also goes and modifies the algorithm itself. So the algorithm is all the time changing itself based on, for instance, what answer you clicked on in the search. The search, for instance, came back with 12 possible responses to your search, you know, and based on the one you click on, the algorithm itself is going to be modified. So next time the same search is already producing different results. So there is a feedback loop, and that will be very important for us later. There is a feedback loop built into the algorithm. But essentially, the model of the frame as the device that takes something from the real world and converts it to information and outputs it as information, this is the very essence of this algorithmic thinking. So let's now have a look. Now I want you to take a leap back and see at the way Foucault situates this specific text, anti-oedipus. So it was written in 1972. Several really important books came out right after the student riots of 1968, 1967. One is Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus. The second is Jean-Francois Lyotard, Libidinal Economy. And the third one, I would say, is Derrida, very famous, of Grammatology. They all were written by young scholars in their 30s, for whom this event was cataclysmic and allowed a lot of, somehow crystallized a lot of issues around what does it mean to make art, to make politics, to live an ethical life in the age of a liberal democracy. So this is Foucault's opening gambit. He says, in the 20 years following the Second World War, following the victory over the Nazi Germany, there was a certain way to be an intellectual. Yeah, there was a proper way of doing it. Only one way of doing it. Yeah, and this way involved familiarity with Marx, and familiarity with Freud. So actually it's three things: Marx, Freud, and science systems. Yeah, these were the three components by which you could recognize a post-Second World War an intellectual. What does it actually mean? What it means in practice? What Marx is doing here? Now, this is not about somehow getting to grips with a rich and wonderful Marxist doctrine, but it's just about understanding that the Marxist thinking seeks to identify in whatever situation you encounter, seeks to identify or to deal with it in terms of class struggle. Yeah? There always will be, in every given situation, someone who is exploited and someone who is exploiting. And as a Marxist, you should perform an analysis of whatever situation you are dealing with in order to identify where the battle lines are drawn between the exploited and the exploiting, the proletariat and the capitalist. Yeah? Now, even if you don't frame it in these terms, even if you frame it in terms of students and teacher, or children and parents, it doesn't matter. What you seek to do is to explore the situation within these parameters of struggle for power between the master and the slave, the child and the parent. Yeah, and it can be the woman and the man. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is always this logic of confrontation between the exploited and someone who exploits. And generally speaking, it is always underpinned by economic struggle, because Marx takes labor as the foundation of his thinking. Now, so what is the problem with that? Well, the problem is not that it's a wrong approach. The problem is that this approach claims a certain totality. It claims that any situation, so you will be able to identify this element of class conflict, of this power relationship in any situation. And that creates a certain universality, a certain totality, but even more importantly, it establishes a certain cut, like a deep cut, it's sometimes called, or a rupture between these two parts. You have the proletariat and you have the capitalist. In between them, what is between them? Struggle. There is nothing in between. There is a sort of a gaping hole. Yeah? Sometimes this basically suggests that there is a kind of cut or a rupture. And that might be a bit of a problem, because when we move to the second part of this expression, to do with Freud, there is something not entirely similar, but also not completely dissimilar in Freud. Now again, it's not about getting to grips with wonderful Freudian theory and his writing, but in Freud there is this, in the same way that in Marx there is this fundamental notion of class struggle, in Freud there is this fundamental notion of Oedipus. Yeah? Now, are you familiar with Freud to some extent? Should I say a few words about it? In Freud, who you are is determined by the trauma of childhood. Now, and that is not a question of whether you had a good childhood or a bad one. Everyone had this trauma. Yeah, no one, and this is a very important postulate of Freudian theory, no one left childhood undamaged. Yeah, if you are carrying the scars of your childhood, they might be weeping and bleeding scars, they might be old scars, you know, you might maybe that whether you feel these scars every day, whether you only notice them occasionally, whether you hardly ever think about them, the scars are there. Yeah? They're all the task of psychoanalysis is to explore these scars, to take you back to these scars and see what actually causes them. And what causes them is overwhelmingly Oedipus. Yeah, the old tale of Oedipus from Greek mythology. For Freud, it means that the process of growing up as a child necessarily involves a certain struggle for power between the child and the father, or the child and the mother. And he chooses to call it Oedipus, and everyone knows the story of Oedipus, but it doesn't really mean that what you want as a child is to have sex with your mother. That's not the point. The point is that you realize as a child that it would be much nicer to be the father rather than the mother. Whether you are a boy or a girl, it doesn't matter. But you realize that in a patriarchal society, and that's the society that Freud explored and wrote about, the father has a much better life, does more interesting things, gets out of the house, going places, while the mother is sort of sitting at home and has a very, sitting in the nursery and playing with the children and maybe even going slightly mad. So the child at some point makes a decision that it would be much better to grow up as daddy, not as mommy. So that's the whole notion of castration and lack and envy and pain and shame. It all envelopes in this notion of Oedipus, and we could explore it and we could open it up, and it is a fascinating and very entertaining story to tell. But I don't want to dwell on it too much because I just want you to get the very sense of these two positions, the Freudian position and the Marxist position. They're both amazingly productive. However, they have this little issue that they take one overarching logic as the entire ground of everything. In Marx, it is the logic of class struggle. In Freud, it is the logic of Oedipus, or you can call it castration, you can call it lack, you can call it fetish, depending, whom you're reading and with whom you want to go to explore that. But what Foucault is saying that for a long time, for 20 years, if you wanted to be considered an intellectual, here is what you had to do. 1, learn to analyze situations from the perspective of class struggle. 2, learn to analyze the individual. So the social situations, class struggle. Individual situations from the perspective of Oedipus. Yeah? So whether you do literary analysis, whether you do cinema, whether you work with art, this is what you are after. You are going to explore the moment of castration, the moment of lack, this moment of shame and frustration and pain that is associated with a childhood trauma. It can be the oral trauma, it can be the anal trauma, it can be the Oedipal trauma, but this is inescapable. And the third one, which he goes over very quickly, is the sign systems which one had to treat with the greatest respect. Now, what are these sign systems? Someone here mentioned last week indexicality, or the index. Yeah? Well, the index is part of this famous sign system that's sometimes also known as semiotics. Yeah? And semiotics had a very good run for its money, especially as far as photography theory goes. Because everyone who studied photography in the late 80s or the 90s had to read Victor Bergin's Thinking Photography, and that is all basically applying this semiotic analysis with a little bit of Lacan thrown in, with a little bit of Marx thrown in to photography. So in a sense, if you think about the kind of the big white elephants of photography theory, like Victor Bergin, for instance, these are the three elements from which this approach to thinking about the image is made. Marx, Freud, and I'll say Lacan. Jacques Lacan is a Freud's disciple who established his own French school of psychoanalysis. And for Lacan, the unconscious is structured like language. Yeah? And language is structured as a sign system. All these things are connected. Now, again, what is the beef? What is the problem? Well, the problem is that this way of thinking puts forward imperceptibly, not overtly, puts forward the notion that there is a certain lack or absence or gap or castration, between these two sides, whether it is the phallus and castration, or proletariat and capital, there is always this gap. And this gap immediately introduces or suggests that there is a kind of, it's a very analytical, very rationally satisfying model, but it is entirely based on binary thinking. Okay? So before you can be a Marxist, before you can be a Freudian, and even before you can become a semiotician, you need to already sign up to the idea of the binary opposites. The binary opposition can be between workers and employers, it can be between the phallus and castration, it can be between signifier and signified. But there is always, out of sight, but not out of mind, the binary divide. And the binary divide is such that the two parts can never meet. Now, if you recall our previous discussions, you might see where I'm going with it. Because obviously we're not just interested in that for the sake of talking about Marx and Freud. We're really interested in the image. Yeah? So what I'm trying to point towards is that in the domain of the image, there is also a kind of divide, between what and what? Between the image and the thing, the model and the copy, the object and its representation, my face and my passport photo, and this, it's exactly the same divide as between the proletariat and the capitalist, or the phallus and castration, or the signified and signified. And of course, these are very different things, but what makes them similar is that they're all based on the same logic of binaries that oppose each other. Right. How are you doing so far? Do you have any questions about that so far? Is there anything that needs more elaborating? Because we can talk about the signifier in more detail. I don't think it's necessary, because it's not about these things, you understand? It is really about a certain methodology, and how a certain methodology, it was incredibly productive for more than 100 years, and produced various magnificent results. Well, we can argue how magnificent they are, but no one can argue the magnitude of the outcomes of these ways of thinking. Well, Foucault says a moment came where these approaches ran their course. They started to run out of steam. It might remind you the conversation we had earlier about when we spoke about data, about the way the optical society of the panoptic observation of discipline runs out of steam at the moment when the machine when the computer replaces the machine. And suddenly it's not about observing someone, it's more about collecting data about them. And even the notion of the them becomes a very different entity, because instead of individuals, we are now individuals. Now, perhaps individuals can be defined by their Oedipal trauma, but can we say the same thing about individuals? Yeah? Perhaps individuals are always caught up in the hand-to-hand combat of the proletariat and the capitalist. But is it also true about the individual? Now, you can see where it is going. You can see that for Foucault and for Deleuze and Guattari, these models of thinking about reality by trying to force it into binary sections, this model is now bankrupt. Why is it bankrupt? Well, first because for a while it was incredibly successful. The Marxist theory, the Marxist model of class struggle gave us the Soviet Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and any number of other political revolutions. The Freudian model gave us Surrealism, Dadaism, and many other art movements, and had a massive influence on the way art is made in the 20th century, and also the way we understand subjectivity as configured through the unconscious. And structuralism, or in other words, semiotics, or all these science systems, became incredibly influential in the way we understand ourselves through anthropology of Lévi-Strauss, for instance, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Yeah. So, I mean, some of you are nodding. I hope it all somehow it touches some buttons. So that's good. Okay. Now, at the same time, things didn't also work out that well, because the communist revolution ended up with the Gulag and the concentration camps. The Maoist revolution brought about the cultural revolution. So it just started to look like this model of us against them, of workers against oppressors. It has some problems, you know. Even Marx already said, even though to many deaf ears, but Marx himself said that every revolution plants the seeds of its own destruction. People didn't want to listen. It's kind of not his fault, really. Most Marxists, by the way, don't read Marx. And that it is a shame. And most people who read Marx are actually not Marxists. But be it as it may, there is the sense that continuing along the same lines will be recreating the same disasters. What is the point of setting up another revolution like the student revolts of '68 on dialectical premises if we have already seen that these dialectical premises end up, basically they end up turning things upside down. So you have the oppressed and the oppressor. They get into this dialectical confrontation of the opposites. They cannot ever mix or merge or just go for a drink or shake hands. They have to be in this struggle. In the struggle, the oppressed wins or loses. If the oppressed loses, then there is more oppressed. But if the oppressed wins, the oppressed then becomes the oppressor, and the whole thing starts again. Yeah. So that kind of draws the curtain on the whole notion of why we need a communist party, why we need radical left politics. What to do if the radical left politics brings about another form of totalitarian regime? Yeah. So these are the questions that 1968 seems to be offering an answer to. Plus, the other thing he mentions on this front page, this great liberal democracy that did conquer fascism, lo and behold, there is this war in Vietnam, and we are in the 60s now. There is this war in Vietnam that looks, you know, to many observers as a very fascist war, not dissimilar to the kind of wars that Hitler and Mussolini would conduct 20 years earlier. And that is a war conducted by a liberal democracy. So again, we have here a kind of sense that the victory over fascism is turning sour, and what we get is not that dissimilar from that which we fought and defeated. That's why, that's why, I forgot to say, at the gate of our world there was Vietnam, of course, and the first major blow to the powers that be. Okay, so so what would be interesting now is to think, okay, so what to do? What is the move? What is the next move if this binary approach seems to be lacking or problematic? Now, of course, Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari were not the first people to concern themselves with that. Adorno and Horkheimer wrote in the 50s, in the early 50s, Dialectic of Enlightenment, where they articulated some similar concerns that basically could be summarized as the realization that the very same structures that brought about enlightenment on all its incredible advances in science, in technology, in health, in civil rights, these same forces are also capable of turning all these conquests into a defeat. Yeah, because it is exactly the same forces that also contribute to the establishment of the fascist state. It is particularly clear, for instance, if you look at Adorno in Negative Dialectics, when he very famously says, poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. You probably heard this expression. But what he really is saying there is that the rational order of the world is exactly what makes fascism possible. Now, why is that? This is quite an interesting point, and it is quite relevant to what we are talking about. Why that is the case? What Adorno is saying is that we have, and whenever we are faced between noticing difference or similarity, we for some reason privilege similarity. Yeah. Now, here is a little example that might explain. Do you know this famous photograph by Diane Arbus, the twins? Yeah. Let's take a quick look at it. Okay, so here's the question, and I guess that is also the question that this image provokes us to think about. Are they similar or are they different? And of course, they're both similar and different. Yeah? Now, it's kind of easy to see it here, but what if, let's say, you go down the road one day, let's say, to buy your brioche, and someone coming towards you with a, this sort of double pram with twins, newborn twins, and they're sort of identical twins, and you look at them and you say, oh my God, they're so similar. But you could also say, oh my God, they're so different. Yeah? So why we choose similarity so automatically? Why we choose identity over difference so automatically? And more to the point, what are the political consequences of thinking in that way? Yeah. Now, I mean, it's so simple that it almost feels sometimes embarrassing to talk about it. Embarrassing actually is a very important word here. because maybe difference is embarrassing. Here we have a photograph of a thing, and here we have a thing. Now we immediately, somehow automatically, focus on the similarities. No one will stop and say, yeah, but look how different the photograph is from the thing. Because it just seems completely, it's so subsumed into the discourse of identity, the difference somehow gets absorbed into identity and managed by it. Now, this is simply how we operate in our everyday life. Adorno says, to think is to identify. We think through identifying. And therefore, because identifying is our way of thinking, difference always remains somehow second, somehow managed or suppressed by identity. But as we saw with the example of twins, difference and identity have similar rights. There's nothing in the image that suggests that it is more identical than it is different, or that the twins are more identical than they are different. And yet, identity for us generally always comes first. Yeah, we always, like people would tell you, oh, you look so much like your father, for instance. They will say that more often. They will say, "Oh, you're so much not like you're so different." Yeah, and so you might disagree, but I just think it's quite interesting to notice how identity always seems to have the upper hand. And why? Well, because there is something interesting about binary oppositions. We mentioned already a few of them. Image and the model is one binary opposition, but also the Marxist one of the master and slave, the Freudian one. In every opposition, in every binary, there is one element that is more dominant, and there is another one that is, let's say, the submissive. In every binary opposition, in binary oppositions, the two terms are not equal. Yeah? Whenever one thing is opposed to another, male to a female, black to white, gay to straight, it doesn't really matter what exactly. In every pair, there will be the dominant, or the more powerful, or the one that is defined in opposition to the other. So here you have a sort of notion that the moment you have a binary, the moment you think in binary terms, you already introduce into your thinking this idea of one side dominating the other. And no matter how much you're going to play with it, no matter how much you're going to, turn the terms of reference, you're not going to escape that within this binary dialectical model, you will also have you will always have the thesis and the antithesis. And guess what? The thesis will always conquer or be more dominant than the antithesis. For that reason, men and women are not equal terms. Yeah. So, if that is kind of, if that starts to make a modicum of sense, the question is then, how can it be otherwise? Is it at all possible? If, as Adorno was saying, to think is to identify what hope there is to oppose, to resist. Because just think about it in this way. Thought itself puts identity before difference. Yeah? But what are the political consequences of that? Well, for one thing, it means that society will strive for some form of being homogeneous, being kind of together, everyone speaking the same language, everyone knows everyone by name. So this is quite, that's identity. That's the sort of, well, at the moment, the sort of political debate that is happening right now in the UK is very interesting about that, because it is very much around this question of identity or difference. So when identity is allowed to have the upper hand, something is happening which people like William Reich, who was a Marxist Freudian thinker, say that leads very quickly to fascism. What fascism is based on? Now, what and it's a little bit important for this text. What is fascism? Fascism is a certain notion of society as a total whole. This is, I mean, fascism doesn't necessarily mean violence. It doesn't necessarily, also it might be, and of course it often does, it doesn't necessarily mean aggression, but it does mean homogeneity. There was this Italian philosopher who was the court philosopher of Mussolini, Giovanni Gentile, and that was his notion of a society. In a fascist society, everyone belongs, and if you don't belong, then you are very clearly and very manifestly out. For that reason, I wanted you to have a look at Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, just because the visual language of this cinema is very much about this notion of totality. Now, even if we just look at this one image, yeah, you see what it is about. This is the people, and this is the Führer. Yeah. So here again, you have this sort of. Here again, there is the binary, the one and the many. In this and between them, this complete rupture, this complete gap, and that's what it means to belong. Now, if you saw this film, you probably noticed that it is quite unbelievably beautiful. But you see that the logic is exactly the same throughout all the editing of this film. And I'm running it without sound because I just thought maybe we don't need Hitler's speech in this room right now, but we can put the sound if you like. In a sense, it's not about the sound, it's about this notion. Here you have the one, and then you will have the many. And it's all the time like this, the one and the many. And from this, you can get the sense of what it's like to belong, of what it's like to feel that you are not alone, to feel that you are part of something, and who wouldn't want to be part of something. There are wonderful scenes of soldiers preparing to meet Führer. And they are really amazing because obviously they are preparing for their rendezvous with death. But it looks so beautiful and enchanting that who wouldn't want to join in? Okay, so we have a few threads open here. Let's try to connect a few of them. So, what is the proposition that Foucault is putting forward here? Well, first we saw that identity in itself is a concept with interesting political connotations, you know, to this drive to identify, you know, with the right technology can put you very quickly on the side of the triumph of the will, you know, because it is all about this joy of identity. And what happens if you are in the Third Reich and you are different? Well, then you are eliminated, you know, as a Jew, as a homosexual, as a traveler, it doesn't matter. As long as the moment you are different, you are out. Because in this model, there is room only for identity. So people like Adorno, and later after him, Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, they say, how can we? They say, well, perhaps the way we structured the argument in binary terms is something, it contributes or helps to establish identity as this dominant feature. Yeah? So how is it possible to think or to do something without identity? There has to be another way that is not based on a binary, or in other words, that is not based on image, on model copy paradigm. Because the moment there is the model copy paradigm, then you immediately have binary, and in the binary, one side will be more dominant, and the whole story begins again. Yeah. Now, so it doesn't really matter if you talk about it from from the field of politics, or the field of psychoanalysis, or the field of aesthetics. The pool of the binary is very similar everywhere, and it goes very deep because it goes to the very origins of Western scientific, political, social, philosophical thinking that is beginning sometime at 500 BC in Athens with Plato, and perhaps a bit later with Aristotle when it begins in earnest. And somehow this whole way of thinking creates an environment that's based on binaries and identity. So here's the thing. We are now coming to a moment where something new is happening, and anti-oedipus gives it a voice. Now think about the title, anti-oedipus, and remember what I said about the Oedipal paradigm being based on this opposition between the phallus and castration, this notion of flood. The anti-oedipus says there is another way, there is a way of doing it, of putting it together, slightly different. Here are so what are the three key points that this book is engaging with? I think this is put so beautifully by Foucault, it is worth reading. So three enemies, three adversaries, as he says, 3 degrees of danger. One, the political ascetics, the sad militants, the terrorists of theory, those who would preserve the pure order of politics and political discourse, bureaucrats of the revolution and civil servants of truth. This is very nicely said. So who are these political ascetics? Well, these are, to be blunt about it, these are the Marxists. This is the Communist Party in France at that time. These are the terrorists of theory. The pure order of politics is precisely the attempt to read every situation through through the binary of class struggle. And bureaucrats of the revolution. Yeah, that is obviously, I think he has in mind Stalin and Mao. And the civil servants of truth. Okay, let's leave that. But this is very interesting because Hegel, the great German philosopher, said, and I think I mentioned it to you, he said, all that is rational is real, and all that is real is rational. And you can, of course, build a whole society on this principle, that everything that is logical is true, and everything that is true is logical. When the state introduces a new law, it relies on the fact that it is doing things in a logical way. So it makes a certain claim for its decisions not being arbitrary, not being irrational, but made in a rational way. And because rationality has this purchase on reality and on truth, that acquires a very strong political power. Yeah? So when you justify your political decisions by the fact that it is logical, you have you have a really strong argument on your side. So how are you going to contest that? I think you can see that quite often in British politics, where, for instance, benefit cuts are often justified in this logical way, saying, well, it stands to reason that someone who is working shouldn't have more money than someone who is unemployed. And of course, yes, it does stand to reason. It's just there is this little problem that when you reason in that way, you also slide towards privileging homogeneity and identity and really bracketing out anything that is different. Because accommodating difference is costly, is expensive. It might be painful, it might be unpleasant. But Foucault is saying, well, if you don't find a way of accommodating the difference, you might find yourself in this triumph of the will situation of a kind of universal totality. Yeah? Do you see how that works? Do you see that actually this discourse of identity is never innocent. It's never too far away from political consequences on the one hand, and on the other, it is never too far away from the way we understand the image, and especially the photographic image, because we often deal with it from the perspective of its identity or lack of identity with reality. Whether by this reality we mean the world outside the image in the physical sense, let's say the trees and the buildings, and or if we mean the internal world of the artist, because generally we talk about images in two ways, either as representations of external reality or as perceptions of the internal, or as, to use the same word, or as representations of the internal life of the artist. And that's the two ways, that's sort of the modern way of talking about the image. Either it represents the world outside or it represents the world within. But hey presto, Foucault is saying both these models have this little problem, this little issue, that they are relying on this notion of the logical, the rational, and that's how you end up with these civil servants of truth. And then the next one. So here he basically has the Marxist politics in his sights. And second is obviously he moves on to the Freudians, the psychoanalysts, the poor technicians of desire, psychoanalysts and semiologists of every sign and symptom, who would subjugate the multiplicity of desire to the twofold law of structure and luck. The twofold law of structure and luck is exactly the binary that we are talking about. The structure relates to structuralism. This is very, very condensed. It's almost like a telegram. Yeah? And that's why I like this text so much, because it is just, it's like a manifesto, it's like a poem, you can learn it by heart. So, structuralism is signifier and signified. Yeah? The signifier and the signified. How it works in language, so for instance, here is a word, lamp. Here is an object, lamp. Yeah. This the word lamp is a signifier, the lamp is a signified, and what is between them? Between them is the semiotic operation of signification. Yeah, where that came from? Is it under the lamp? It's not under the lamp. It is a logical operation. You immediately have to introduce the notion of the subject who makes these connections. Okay, so these are the poor technicians of desire. It's the people who want to understand desire only through the Oedipal syndrome. You know, if you ever spoke to someone about your relationship, and they said, well, you know, Oedipus, Schmidipus, that's what Freud, that's what Foucault here has in mind. It's just too quick, it's just too easy. Desire is not one thing. Desire is a multiplicity. We will get to that a little bit later. Now, and last but not least, the strategic adversary is fascism. Not only historical fascism, the historical fascism of the triumph of the will, not only historical fascism, but also, and listen to that, this is really interesting, the fascism in us all, in our heads, in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. Yeah? This is very interesting because not many people before that text said that the fascist enemy is not Italy of Mussolini or Germany of Hitler or Japan. The fascist enemy is the fascist within. Yeah? Within each and every one of us, there is this fascist entity. Now, why? Is it because we are somehow choose to be bad? Well, no. It's because our thought is driven by the desire for identity. Identity excludes difference. Identity excludes everyone who does not belong, who does not fit in. And therefore, we somehow, on this slippery slope towards, as it says, desiring the very thing that dominates and exploits us, that causes us to love power. You know, so for Foucault, the challenge is not to identify fascism as something that the other or the enemy is. Yeah? Because, you know, fascism is one of these words, I think even George Orwell wrote about it. It's a word that became completely meaningless in the common parlance because it's basically the way you name anyone who is not like you. Or anyone you don't like, they become the fascist. And Foucault is saying, well, no, not so fast. It is inside yourself. Now, do you have any questions or not, or anything you want to say at this point? No?
Yeah, is this love of power and this desire, can this be equated to the modern notion of greed, of always wanting more, keeping up with the Joneses?
It could be, but I think it is much more than that, because I think we can see this power in his book of short epigrams, Minima Moralia. Adorno has this example for power. He talks about the way fascism is really imbued in everyday life, and he says, who didn't experience, when they're behind the wheel of a car, this deep desire to wipe away the pedestrians and the cyclists and all the people who just get in the way of this machine, you know? There is something about sitting behind the wheel of the car and the power that it gives you that somehow makes you, and you know, I know this myself because sometimes I cycle and sometimes I go behind the wheel, and the moment I'm behind the wheel, all this sort of, it already getting in the way. You know, I just want the drive and the thrust and the push. And Adorno said, well, guess what, this is very interesting. You know, I think it's that. Greed obviously will come into this as well, but the love of power is not only the love of our own power, is also the love of powers to be. It's the love of the government, it's the love of the queen. You know, why do we love them so much? Why do we love those, as he says, the very thing that dominates and exploits us? In the book itself, Deleuze and Guattari keep asking, they say, how come people are all the time shouting, less bread, stronger chains, less bread, stronger chains? And the answer is because, and in a sense that is exactly what is happening in here. That's why I keep going back to this. I mean, what is going on here? What are so happy about? I mean, they know they're going to die, you know. What are they so happy about? This is the love of power. Does it make sense? Now, Foucault is saying that this is, he calls it the fascism of everyday life. And this is important because it's important for Foucault that we stop thinking about fascism as something that is happening in Zimbabwe, you know, or in Israel, or, you know, in ISIS. Of course, these are all, you know, evil, fascist situations. But he says there is also fascism in yourself, and it is deeply connected to the way this liberal democracy is organized on exploitation. So did we really manage to get out of Marx? Well, not completely, not quite. But it's an attempt. Because this is just the list of these three enemies. You know, the Marxist with the doctrine of the class struggle, the Freudian analyst that always demands of you to do this transference, you know, to disclose your childhood trauma, to project your desire for the mother or your hatred for the father onto the therapist. And this is the contract you enter into if you are in a psychoanalytic therapy. And most importantly, the fascist in us all. And here he says, now that is why, I'm taking you back to the image. This is why I offered you this as a quick summary or a provocation of this essay. Now, here is the program for a new form of political existence, a new form of ethics, when the binary model is proven bankrupt. It's proven that it leads to it doesn't help us, this binary model, to deal with the fascist within. So what we have, a very quick, very brief program, several points. Free political action from all unitary and totalizing paranoia. Develop action, thought, and desires by proliferation, juxtaposition, and disjunction, and not by subdivision and pyramidal hierarchization. So what that means is that organize or act through multiplicity. There is only one way, he says here, you can get away from the binary. The way to get away from the binary, it's not by turning the opposites one more time, like an hourglass. That will not get you there. What you want to do is to start thinking in multiplicities. Not either or, not male or female, not black or white, not, you know, British or European, but and. Male and female, black and white, cat and dog, gay and straight. So, when you start thinking in multiplicities, in proliferations, when you allow things to proliferate. Later on, they came up with a concept that defines that, and it became very famous, and it is the rhizome. You familiar with this? The rhizome? No? Yes? What is a rhizome? That.
I'm sorry, I thought it was a question.
Well, yeah.
In botany, it's a root, but metaphorically, it means something that spreads and doesn't have that kind of a hierarchical structure.
Anyone here has a garden? Have you ever met the Japanese knotweed? No. This is a rhizome. You know, I mean, that's something that doesn't need to be something beautiful or nice. You know, ginger root, mushrooms. Rhizome is a way of proliferation in which there is no central stem. Let's say if we remain with botany for a second. A tree has a certain central stem. You plant the seed in the ground, and you have the trunk, and all the branches come off the trunk. Now imagine a situation in which there is no trunk. There are only branches, and they can just sprout in different places. Yeah. So this Japanese knotweed, it just sprouts. You know, you might eradicate it in one place, and then it comes somewhere else. Yeah. Now some political organizations operate like this. For instance, ISIS is a rhizome. Yeah. Where is it? Well, it's in Syria. It's in Iraq. It is in Libya. It is in the UK. It is in France. You know, how do we fight something like that? You know, it is exactly like Japanese knotweed. You know, the whole notion of let's go after the root, let's pull the root out of the ground and destroy it, not going to work because there is no root. There is another logic afoot here. It's a very, very powerful logic. This is the logic of the rhizome. Yeah? That is what meant by multiplicity. Develop action, thought, and desires by proliferation. Now, what it might mean for someone who wants to work photographically, you know, how can we understand photography as a rhizome? That's what would be really interesting to think about, because generally, photography has this also kind of a sort of tree-like model. Yeah, we have the object from which we start, or the negative that we can always go back to, or the raw file, and we go and make all these copies, but ultimately all these copies are somehow connected to the root, right? That's the analog model. Whether it is done with pixels or with chemicals, the model in which the image, in the end of the day, begins its life from a certain point in reality, or in a certain file, or in a certain negative. This way of thinking is arboreal, is teleological. You remember I told you last week that the Greek word telos means target. Yeah, it indicates this connection between the beginning and the end. But can we think about the image as a rhizome? What if, for instance, we will say that online, it doesn't really matter if the image has a point of origin in some reality. What more matters is by which forces the image proliferates, gets distributed. How come that, you know, someone might upload a picture or a video of some kind of, I don't know, a dog on a skateboard, and it becomes a sensation, and millions of people view it? Is it because there is really a dog? That's kind of not enough. No, we also need to start thinking about how this proliferation is happening. Yeah. So it is possible to start thinking about the online image, not in terms of what reality it belongs to, what reality it connects to, but what are the forces that allow it to distribute itself, to self-replicate, and to disseminate. So maybe we need to think not so much about what is the real that the image is connected to, but we might think about what hashtags, tags, comments, likes are somehow envelope this image, creating its own metadata or data shadow, and how all these environments, which are always both coding environments and linguistic and technological, how they create this endless proliferation. Take any image. For instance, the very famous, very sad image of Alan Kurdi, the Syrian 4-year-old boy that was drowned, and this picture of him lying on the sand in Turkey became, for a while was the most often viewed image online. Now, try to imagine in your head, not the one picture, you know the picture I'm talking about, everyone knows. Try to imagine not the one picture, but its distribution. Where is it right now? The moment you start thinking about it in that way, you realize that you are dealing here not with an image that relates to a certain reality, but with a horizon. Yeah, it is also a horizon. Yeah, because yes.
So we don't ask the question of meaning anymore?
No, we do ask the question of meaning, but this is the meaning. It is, the meaning is not only in the connection with some real, because this rhizomatic dispersion is also real. Both. So again, we don't want to make the mistake of having another binary flip-flop. What we want to say is that, can we hold both things at the same time? Can we say the image can move us because of two things? Because on the one hand, something really happened, and it is shocking, or happy, or sad, or silly. Something really happened. But also, there is a process. The process is the event. So the image is at the same time an image and an event. A picture of something and the event of its distribution.
And in this case, it was proliferation of the image that actually released the awareness of the public in Britain.
Well, I think, yeah, because there were many similar images. There is one very interesting example. There was a very similar visual image of a dead boy lying on a beach in Gaza about a year before that, and and it just it just fell dead of the press, as they say. A stillborn. Nobody really noticed, but formally very similar sound, similar boy, similar age, similar clothes, but didn't stick. Why? Well, you might want to explain it simply in terms of content and formal qualities of the image. It seems to me that it really would be incredibly one-sided, because there is the whole apparatus of reproduction and proliferation that is also the image. So what I'm trying to get you to realize is that the image is both visible and invisible. The event that we explored last week is real. It's undeniably something that is happening, and yet it has no visual form. So the photograph or the image has a visual aspect to it, and it has a non-visual aspect. And this non-visual aspect is related to this question of proliferation. Now, what does it say in the next section? Withdraw allegiance from the old categories of the negative, law, limit, castration, lack, lacuna, which Western thought had so long held sacred as a form of power and access to reality. It should make sense to you now, what it says here, because withdraw lines from what? In two words, from binary opposites. Withdraw lines from thinking in either or terms. Because whenever you have either or, you always have the negation, you always have the negative. Thesis and antithesis. Yeah? They are opposites. They have to negate. That's the famous Hegelian negation. But this negative is also the Freudian castration, is also the law that is based on logical or rational premises. But it's also lack, It's again the Freudian notion. So these are, for Western thought, this is a form of power and access to it. Why is it a form of power? Because, as I said, the government can justify quite cruel behavior by the fact that it is rational, yeah? Logical. Now, I'm only interested here in the way justification for a certain action is being grounded in logic. We can do that, and it will be the right thing to do because it is the logical thing to do. Yeah? When the Prime Minister comes and says that, yeah, we want to help the poor, but first we need to have a strong economy, it is using this form of logic that uses logic as a form of power and not just to reality. Because everything then gets framed from within this rational, logical model. It's unassailable in a sense, because as long as you stay within this model, you cannot better that. The only way to better it is to get out of this model and propose another one. Now, and finally, do not think that one has to be sad in order to be militant. I think that's a very nice point. What is the connection? Well, sadness is the effect of the Oedipal trauma. You know, this is the Freudian notion, but it has very much older roots. Baruch de Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher, said that priests and rulers want their subordinates to be sad. Because when people are sad, they are much easier to control. And that's why you have the Christian story of hell, that awaits you, and they're very good reasons. And that's why you are born into sin, because if you are a sinner, then clearly you will not have many reasons to be joyful, and if you are sad, you will be easier to control. And Foucault is saying, don't think that you need to be sad to be militant, even though the thing one is fighting is abominable. It is, so in a sense, what is the opposition, what is the alternative to the binary model? In 5 or 7 words, against the sadness of the binary model that is always based on luck, on castration, on law, on rationality, on identity. Against this model, propose multiplicity, propose proliferation, propose desire. Not the monolithic desire for the mother, as Freud would have it, but multiple desire, polymorphous desire. So here is a political program for that contemporary moment. Do not use thought to ground the political practice in truth. Well, you could almost say, do not use truth as a ground for your thinking about the image. There has to be another logic. It's not enough that this picture is for something that happened. This is not sufficient. Use political practice as an intensifier of thought. This is quite interesting. How are we doing for time? What was it? Almost run out of let's just look at the very last sentence. The book often leads one to believe it is all fun and games when something essential is taking place, something of extreme seriousness, the tracking down of all varieties of fascism, from the enormous ones that surround and crush us, to the petty ones that constitute the tyrannical bitterness of our everyday lives. Yeah? So here is the plan, and this is that's what gets explored in anti-oedipus. How to trace, it's almost like a sort of going around with a sniffer dog, Now how to trace all residues of fascism in everyday life, from the big political events to the tiny little petty ones that constitute the tyrannical bitterness of our everyday life. Okay, so it's already 8 o'clock, but I want to take just one more minute to suggest that while this is not at all talking about images, what is being proposed here can be directly taken as a way of thinking about images. So by the way, if you don't mind me taking another 2 minutes of your time, it's not by accident that on this course we don't read any books that have photography in their title or anywhere in the body, because books that write about photography immediately treat it within this binary proposition of image, model, original. And because they do that, they always end up with a very similar end result, whether they look at the photograph structure out from a structuralist perspective like Bergin, or from a psychoanalytic perspective like Christian Metz, or from a sort of Marxist. Yes.
There is a book though from Goldsmith's professors. I think Teresa Zelensky. She writes.
Joanna Zelensky.
Yeah, she writes in a very diverse perspective.
Oh yes, she does. Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's true, and it was a sweeping statement. I accept that. But I think as a general rule, and also Wilhelm Flusser's Towards Philosophy of Photography is not is different. But as a general rule, most fundamental texts of photography that you will find in the Photography Reader and in all these critical introductions, they all do exactly what Foucault is telling us to be wary of. They all set up this binary model. They all somehow end up either in the Freudian camp, or in the Marxist camp, or in the structuralist camp, or in some kind of pick and mix. Whenever you hear someone talking about the index, rest assured that their thinking is binary. And now you already know what are the political consequences, or might be, of that thinking. So next week we're going to go head first into this essay, this chapter by Deleuze, that's called Image of Thought. Not thought about an image, but an image of thought. What does it mean exactly? What is the image of thought? If you had to make an image of thinking, what it will look like. What I want to suggest during this session next week is that a photographic image is an image of thought, of sorts, that we will explore. Okay, so if you want to stay to have some more questions, we can do it now. Questions?
So I have a question, but it's a big one, I think, maybe like next.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, kind of, we speak all the time about the binaries, and that this new thinking goes away from binaries, but then there's still like a huge binary underpinning even the new thinking, which is actually like old versus new, good versus bad, so like the ethical aspects, and like we're not doing away with binaries.
No.
And also the example that you gave is an excellent one about ISIS, and which operates in a rhizomatic base. So why is rhizomatic thinking exactly desirable? It might lead to the same horrible consequences.
Rhizomatic, rhizomatic thinking is powerful. It is powerful. Power can be used for whatever means you want. The Israeli military is very good at using Deleuzian models in order to plan its incursions into Palestinian territory. Eyal Weizmann wrote about it very beautifully quite a long time ago. So the rhizome is not holy, it's not blessed, it's just a form of power. Yeah, what we're going to be slightly behind if we don't learn how this form of power operates. Because as long as we try to deal with it as if it is a binary, if we try to deal with a Japanese knot weight as if it is a tree, we're not going to defeat it. And maybe it is impossible to defeat. Maybe we need to learn how to live with it, I'm told that you can make very tasty, like a rhubarb jam from it. Maybe that's the way. Just eat it, you know. Just make it your staple. But this is the point. Yeah. So it is definitely not not a good thing. It's a powerful thing. We kind of, but I think it's a very good point that you raised, because in a sense we move away from thinking. It's a shift from thinking in terms of good or bad, male or female, thinking about power. In power there is no good or bad, there's only more or less. There is a big difference between more or less power and good or bad. Because whenever there is a question of good or bad, someone is on hand to make a judgment. Yeah? So you judge that ISIS is bad. Okay, but this is a judgment. Now when there is a question of power, a judgment is not required. If you and I will do arm wrestling, and one of us will get the other down, you don't need the judge. In a sense, it is already in the action. Yeah? The action itself is sufficient.
But the action is meaningless in a way if that criteria not there, so you have to know the framework, like if you're wrestling and something happens.
You have to know the framework. You definitely, yeah. But the framework now is a kind of frameless framework. Because it's not anchored in the presence of external authority. If you and I do an arm wrestling match, it's not what is taken as the ground. Well, yeah, the table, but not the presence of a hierarchy. Yeah. So I know all examples that they are problematic. All examples can be argued with, and you are right that we cannot step out of binaries, but we can augment binaries with the rhizome. Now that is what the second book after the anti-oedipus, it's called Thousand Plateaus, is dealing with in greater depth. How you actually work with the rhizome poetically, politically, aesthetically, militarily. That's why I think the Israeli military made very good use of it. It's a sort of complex thing. In the wrong hands, it can cause a lot of damage, but it also is quite powerful. Now, I think it's very important to understand how this shift away from the binary is really relevant to a lot of contemporary art practice. Artists very often try to step away from these binary categories and try to make things that don't sit very comfortably within sort of image thing categories. Okay. Any other questions?
Just curious on your own approach and thoughts in tackling this complexity in the binary and the I don't know.
Well, it's not so much my approach. I'm just pointing out to what Foucault is saying. He gave us several points how to deal with it. How to overcome the binary in your practice, whether you're a writer, an artist, a politician, an activist, a militant, it doesn't matter, a lover, in whatever thing you do, what is the alternative to binary thinking? And here, develop thought by proliferation, which means, it's okay to do things which are not connected to each other. It's okay to start and stop and start something else. Don't feel that everything has to have some overarching narrative or meaning. Do not think that one has to be sad. Don't withdraw alliance. Don't work with negative. Don't work with the negative. Stop thinking in opposite terms. Don't ground your political practice in truth. Don't base your claim on saying this is true or this is logical. Find another way. Ground your political practice in your creative drive as an intensifier of thought. And finally, do not become enamored of power. Make of it what you will. Okay, shall we call it a day? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.